Hey guys, Julian here from synthwavepro.com. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. So in this synthwave tutorial, let's explore a few tips for creating compelling synthwave melodies. Let's get started. All right, so let's get started here. I'm just gonna play a little excerpt as to the song we're gonna check out. So this is what it sounds like, and we're gonna break down some basic core elements here in regards to melody. All right, so a fairly straightforward A section. Later on, we're going to discuss the B section and then subsequently the C section. But let's get back to the A section here. What I've done here is that I've isolated most of the core elements of this excerpt, meaning we have the melody in this channel here, played by a piano. We have the chords of this section played by another piano. And then lastly, we have the bass. So this is what it sounds like when I have three pianos playing those individual parts. And we're doing this for the sake of this tutorial so we can better understand what is going on in terms of melody and harmony, etc. All right, so now let's turn our attention to this melody part A section. This houses the melody, obviously. And right down below here, these are the chords. Now we have this playing in another channel here, so I just wanted to isolate every part so we can clearly see what is going on. So for instance, take a look at the chords that are being played during this excerpt. So we have the C minor chord here. Let me just blow this up a little bit so we can see the exact notation. There we go, D sharp. This is really E flat, so C, E flat, G, simple C minor chord followed by a G minor chord. So we have G, B flat, D, and then FAC. So basically these are the chords, and as you can see we have them in their sort of root position. We're not doing any types of inversions. There's no first inversions or anything like that. Fairly straightforward, and that's the way I wanted to build this song out. All right, so to build out the melody here, what we've done is that we've used a combination of chord tones and I guess scale tones. So for instance, the very first note of this melody is the D. And when you play this over the C minor chord here, you basically are playing the ninth. So where do we get this ninth from, right? Where does this come from? Let's turn to the C minor scale. So we have C, D is the second, the minor third would be the E flat, and then the F, the G is the fifth, followed by the A flat, B flat, and C. And if we continue going up the scale, we find ourselves with the 9 here. Okay, so I just happened to pitch this up an octave higher, and so just to cause some separation between the chords section and the melody. So I'm playing this note a little higher, and so this represents the ninth of that chord. Later on, you can see as the melody develops and we play the G, G, B flat, D, we fall onto a C. This is also not so much a chord tone, it's more of a tension note. And then finally, when we get to this area here where we have the F, A, C, we land on a sort of solidifying chord tone. So we have a bit of a tension note here followed by another tension note in regards to the G minor chord. And then finally, we get some sort of, some sort of release. So let me just play this section. All right, so that sort of sounds like it's final. It's like da na na ba na ba. All right, and so we essentially repeat the pattern here. Okay, so what's happening here is that they're almost identical. We are starting this cadence or this section here with yet again the D, the ninth of the chord, because we still have the C minor chord here at the bottom, followed by the G minor chord. And again, the upper note here is C. It's not necessarily a chord tone, But lo and behold, by the time we get to the resolution of this sort of, phrase, we have it landing on the A, right? And this happens to be the fifth of this chord, which is a D minor chord. So D, F, A. It's the same note as back here, whereas I was landing on an F major chord with the A, which is the major third of this chord. We're repeating the sequence with a slight variation here. And then by the time we repeat that A, we have it landing on a D minor chord. So it should work, right? Okay, so now let's look at bar number 5 here. We're pretty much going to repeat the sequence, but we are going to alter the notes here. Okay, so let me play this as of bar number 5. Okay, so that pretty much concludes this entire phrase. It's pretty much an 8-bar phrase here. And you'll often hear this in classical music and as well as pop, music. Vocalists do this a lot. If they are repeating a sequence, usually by the time we get to the third iteration of that sequence, there's usually some type of variation. And that's exactly what we have going on here. We have sort of, this is one chunk, if you will. This is the second chunk. And then by the time we get to the third chunk right over here, we are going to have some type of alteration just to sort of break up the monotony. By now, the listener has a very good idea of what the melody sounds like, and this sort of element of surprise keeps the track a little more interesting. Okay, so let me play this first 8 bars here. Okay, so there you have it, an 8-bar phrase. When you're thinking in terms of melodies, it's always a great idea, if possible, of course, to create a melody with sort of longer phrasing. Instead of 4 bars or even 2 bars where you're just repeating the same sequence, try to think of the melody in terms of a longer sentence, right? With multiple words. You don't want to go too crazy and vary it too much. You do want some consistency. Your listener wants to be able to engage with your song, engage with your track, so you want to keep things relatively simple, but every now and then you can throw in these sort of, magic curveballs, if you will. So something to add to your production. There are simple ways to get a track started. Some artists begin with a drum beat, while others have a simple melody in mind. Now, if you don't have a melody in mind, start off by playing some chords, followed by a bass line, and finally add a melody. Now let's take a look at some of the note choices. Like I've mentioned, we're using different chord tones, we're using ninths, we're using thirds. This is just a matter of either playing it on your keyboard or just plotting it in your piano roll, as I've done here. And this is a great way of writing melodies sometimes. You're basically using the available material, the chord changes here, and then plotting it on your graph, and hopefully, you get something that jumps out at you, and then you can start building your melodies here. If I can offer a general tip, you want to use chord tones, of course, the root, the third, the fifth, sometimes the ninth, even the seventh. That has a nice sort of, especially the major seventh, it has a nice tone or ring to it, if you will. All right, so if you don't really care for music theory, and that's absolutely fine, there are a lot of artists out there who don't really use music theory. They tend to use their ear, use instincts, and just the vibe, right? And well, one thing they do like to do is start off with some basic chords, and this is what we have going on here. This is our chord sequence. You've seen it in the other MIDI clip here, but this is what it looks like. Fairly straightforward. We have a C minor chord, G minor chord, F major chord, so on and so forth. Nothing too complicated. And one thing you will notice is that these chords tend to jump around. I mean, this is pretty much a big jump here between the C and the G. Pianists and music theory buffs would tell you that you should use inversions. This way the progression is a little smoother. It tends to sound a little more, cohesive, but that's not what I wanted. I really wanted these big jumps, and that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. The song is sort of supposed to be on the playful side, something like how a child would play the piano, right? And so the point is, this is a good starting point for building out your melody. So these are the underlying chords. These are taking up the mid-range of your frequency spectrum, and up above is your melody. So this is where you would punch in the notes, and you want to make sure that they correspond with some of the notes below. Now, as I've mentioned, not every single note will be a chord tone. Not everything will land on a, a root, a third, a fifth, or a seventh. But the key takeaway here is that once you have a sort of breathing space here, right, this second bar, you want to make sure that you have a chord tone that's going to correspond with the underlying chord structure. So this is the A, and you can see that it does line up with our F major chord here. You can sort of get away with these tension notes when they're sort of passing and they're not really being played for a long period of time, but you want the sort of resting notes, the sustained notes, to be one of those chord tones. And this is the idea behind building out this melody. So as a tip, you probably want to go in here and start punching in some notes and making sure that there is a level of repetition throughout the sequence. You just don't want to punch in random notes for a 8-bar count and then they sort of don't match. You want them to sort of, work together. And think in terms of the listener. What would the listener want to hear? The listener wants to be engaged after maybe 2, maybe 4 bars. They should pick up on the overall vibe of the melody so that by the time it loops back into the sequence, they should be able to get at least 80, maybe 85% of the melody just by singing it, right? You got them hooked, all right? So that's one thing to look for when you are building out your melodies. Now let's look at this bridge section here. I'm just going to play the actual song and we can dive in a little deeper. This is a great way of writing your entire arrangement. You can come up with 3 or maybe 4 different parts for it, put them in a piano, and separate your melodies, your chords, as well as your bass. All right. Fairly straightforward. We are using elements of our part A section for this part B or bridge section. And again, using some chord tones, using some scale tones to build this melody out. And as you can see here, I'm pretty much spelling out the chord tones. As we have the G minor chord here, I'm just going from the 5th, which is the D, the B flat, and the G, and I'm doing the same thing to build out this FAC chord, this F major chord. I'm starting from the 5th, which is the C, A, and then F. Okay, so what's going on here? Again, same sequence for this part. We're repeating it here. And here's a bit of, I guess, a new curveball. But we're definitely repeating that sequence here, but we are altering some of the notes here. Okay, so again, when you are building out your melodies, again, using some repetition, right? We've seen this before in the previous section, and then we are introducing a whole new sequence here, and then a variation of that sequence right over here. All right, so let's turn to part C here. This is what this sounds like. So the piano part is as follows. In fact, let's go ahead and open up this piano part here. This is the same sequence, just with everything in one part. You know, what's really interesting with this sequence is that there are some times where the notes sound off, but in the context of the actual song, once you take the melody, assign it to a voice, take the chords, assign it to another voice, and then take that bass line and assign it to a bass part, they sort of gel together. And the part I'm talking about here is these very sort of tension-filled chords, right? Da, na, na. I mean, the voicing is kind of absurd, but I think it makes sense once you play the actual song. It's not as jarring when you have, you know, reverb and you have this sort of ethereal chord change, right? And I think the vibe has a lot to do with what you can and cannot get away with. So, you know, again, with synthwave and, you know, putting it in the sort of euphoric space, you do get away with these sort of weird tension-filled sequences. And you wouldn't think for a second that that sounds off. You'd think, oh, wow, what a cool, interesting vibe, you know? But under different conditions, you play that same part, you may think, you know, anyways, it's a little side note here. But anyways, moving back to this whole thing, this is another starting point when it comes to writing out melodies, writing out bass lines and chords. You can actually do this with a piano and just have your bass line here in the lower register. All right, so I've decided to use longer notes here instead of these staggered dotted eighth notes. And as for the mid-range here, this is the chord sequence. And then, of course, the upper register, this is where you'd put your melody. So again, this is one way of building out your song. You can actually start off with a piano roll, come up with the chords. If you have a bass line in mind, you can add the bass line, and then the third step would be adding the melody. Later on, when you're happy with it, this is when you can begin to assign different instruments to these parts. Now, there's really no secret as to which notes you should and shouldn't play. It's really a matter of practice. It's a matter of your own sort of personal musical style and what you're basically trying to convey. So if I can offer any tips there, it's really a question of getting into the piano roll and experimenting or using your own ears. If you're new to the channel, thank you for hanging out and consider subscribing and liking this video. If you've been here since the very beginning, I thank you once more for your support. That being said, stay safe and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.